You can't just walk onto a college campus on the first day of class and start. You have to do things before that to be prepared and to get accepted. You have to first maybe think about what you might want to study. You have to look at the kind of schools you might want to go to. You have to pick a few of them and go visit them maybe. You have to apply. You have to figure out how to pay for it, which means often applying for scholarships and applying for financial aid and going through all of these steps so you can get to that place where you can walk onto that campus. Now, if you don't do these things well, then the end result might not be great. You might end up getting into a school that's not the one you want to be at, or studying something you don't want to study, and then you have to change your mind later, and if you don't get the costs all squared away, you can end up with huge amounts of debt. It takes forever to pay off. There's all kinds of cost that goes along with this. I remember doing this with my parents. I decided that I wanted to study engineering, and I didn't want to go to a big school, so I found a couple in Missouri, where I was from, that looked like they would work. But then I got a card from the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. Never heard of it. Drove all the way to Terre Haute, Indiana with my mom, fell in love with the place, at which point my mom said, "This one's too expensive, you can't go here." So I did what any good child does, and I convinced my dad to go with me for a visit. And Dad saw it and said, "This place is great. We got to figure out how to get you here." So I applied for an ROTC scholarship, and we went through all of these steps, right? But all of this is to say you can't just show up. You have to do some work to get into this place, and you have to do some calculating. Jesus today gives us two little stories, metaphors about calculating. One is about a tower. He said you wouldn't just go start building a tower. The first thing you do is sit down and decide if you have enough resources to get it done. And then you start. Otherwise you get partway through and everybody ridicules you for not getting it all the way done. The second metaphor he gives is a little bit different. It's one about war. If you have 10,000 troops and you're facing 20 and you don't think you can win that battle, you would lose a lot of people, you instead decide to offer terms of peace so that you can live through and live another day. Both of these stories are about calculating, about looking at the landscape in front of you, making a calculation, and deciding if you can bear the cost to get to the destination that you want to get to. Now, Jesus is telling these stories about calculation to a crowd of people that is following him around, and he's telling them to get them to have a sense about what the cost of following Jesus is. Now, to be a disciple is to follow a rabbi or a teacher, to do what they do and try to be like they are in the world. And so Jesus is saying to this crowd, if you want to do like I do and be like I am, you have to hate your family, hate your own life, and give away all your stuff. Otherwise, you can't be a disciple of mine. Now, hate is a strong word, and when we hear it, we probably hear animosity and division and all kinds of the stuff that we think of with hate. And it is a strong word, and it does mean that, but it can also, in this case, mean more of a distancing oneself, a disowning of family, putting oneself, our own goals, like hating your own life would be taking your own goals, hopes, and dreams and setting them aside in favor of being a follower of Jesus. So what he's saying is you need to put me first, following me, doing like I do, and trying to be like I be first, and all the rest of the stuff gets set aside. And that's what it means to be a disciple. Now, I struggle with this text for a lot of reasons. One of them is that Jesus is talking to this crowd of people and asking them to make a calculation. Now, there are plenty of other places in Scripture where God calls people to do things and they make a calculation. He says to Moses, "You're going to lead my people out of slavery," and Moses says, "Wait a minute, I stutter and nobody's going to listen to me." So he's done the calculation that he's not the right person, and God says, "No, yeah you are." Jeremiah is called to be a prophet. He says, "I'm not old enough." He's made the calculation that he's not old enough to do this job, and God says, "Sure you are." Esther, the queen, she becomes queen, and all of the Jews are going to be killed, and her cousin says, "You got to go talk to the king." And she makes the calculation and says, "That could cost me my life." And her cousin says, "Well, maybe you were brought to this place for just such a time as this, right? God has called you into this." And she goes and does that. In the book of Judges, Gideon is called by God to come lead the people out of oppression. And Gideon says, "I am the weakest of the least of the tribes. I'm probably not your person." He's made that calculation. And God says, "Nope, you're the one," right? So in all of these places of Scripture where God calls people who feel unworthy because they've made the calculation, we now turn around and get Jesus giving us a calculation to make that is really hard to live up to. And I struggle with that. Now, Jesus didn't say to the crowd, "Come be my disciples," as he did with some. they have followed him and chosen to be in that space. But still, in that space, he seems to be talking about calculating our ability to follow God in ways different from Scripture. And I struggle with that a little bit. The next part of it I struggle with is that we all can't do this, right? How many of you have distanced yourself completely from your family and given away all your stuff? Right? In all of my life in the church, which has been since I was a little kid, I met one Catholic priest while I was working at the hospital as a chaplain who really did move away from family. You got a sense from talking to him that he had wanted to maybe get married and have kids, but he felt this calling so deeply that he set that aside, right? Hating your own life, disowning all of that. And he had taken a vow of poverty for the order of priests that he was a part of. So I have met someone that seems to have been able to accomplish this thing of being a disciple of Jesus, but I struggle because most of us can't do it. So Jesus is talking about making calculations in ways that most of the time God doesn't seem to do. And then it's something that we all would seem to completely fail. But I also struggle with this because I'm not sure this is how the journey of faith works. When I think about my choosing of a school, it was not a simple one-time calculation that then unfolded exactly like I planned. I sat down with my parents and we calculated this all out, and I went away to the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology and I figured out that I didn't want to be what? An engineer. So I'm now at a school that only has engineering degrees, and the Army is paying for it, and I wasn't so sure the Army was quite right for me at that time either. So now I had to make a choice. And I've gone down this path, I've made the calculation, and then I got to that place, so I had to make a different choice. So I chose to go back home, and when I went back home to a different school, all of the scholarships that I had from the beginning didn't apply anymore. So it was a very expensive decision to go the one and now go back the other way. And my dad never said I told you so. My mom might have, I can't remember. But all of that is to say that I ended up back at this other place. And what did I decide to study? Engineering, right? I changed because I didn't want to be an engineer, but we can be very stubborn when we have these choices before us in life. So I went along and studied engineering anyway because it just seemed like it would be easier to finish that. And then I got done with school, and did I go back to school again later? I did, and I'm back in school again, right? And all of this is to say my journey has not been one of starting at the beginning and making some calculation that I got right. I got the math wrong more than I got it right. And then living into that step by step in different ways that kind of meandered around. And so as Jesus is talking to this crowd of people, he's not talking to a job fair of people that showed up to find out what the job of disciple looks like. He's not sort of pitching it to them all and saying, hey, we got positions open, who's interested? No, these people have already decided to follow him around. The crowd is following him around. They decided that day not to do something else. They decided not to work. They decided not to spend time, whatever they might have had to do at home. They weren't out looking for places to eat or getting food for the day. They were just following Jesus. Why? Well, some of them was probably curiosity. I would bet that many of them it was hope. Hope that in following him around they might find healing. They might find wholeness in their life. They might find some reconciliation for the relationships in their lives that were broken. And so here they are following. So as Jesus tells them this story, he's not talking to people that are just, showing up for a job application. He's talking to people that are already in some way on a faith journey. So as he pitches this calculation, right? You have to calculate these costs and decide that you can do it. I struggle with it because that's not how God seems to work in other ways. It's not how we generally seem to journey in our journey of faith, because the people have already shown up, and the calculation is one that most of us just can't get our minds around saying yes to. So what could it be that is going on in this text then? And I would suggest today that our journeys of faith that really go in all kinds of meandering ways and that go kind of step by step, that maybe what Jesus is giving us is a realistic picture of what it means to follow him, and that is a hard thing to do, but not something that we have to calculate once, but a calculation that comes again and again as we go along. And so what he's doing is inviting us into a journey of life. In the text from Deuteronomy, we heard that God set before the people blessings and curses and said to choose life. And so if we think about this as a journey of faith, that every step we take gets us deeper into living in God's grace and deeper into life, then what Jesus is doing is giving us an invitation. And it's a realistic invitation that says, as you go, some of these choices are going to be hard. Yes, you may have to sometimes put Jesus ahead of what it would seem like is best for your family. Yes, you may have to set aside your own hopes and dreams sometimes. Yes, you may have to even give up your stuff if you want to continue this journey and path of life for us. Now, when you look at that calculation, even if it's just one at a time as you go along, just like my school journey, right? One calculation, another one later. Even if they come bit by bit, they can still be expensive. And that's where the cross comes in. Because on the cross, in that Deuteronomy text, it says, choose life. On the cross, Jesus chose life for us. Chose death so that he could bring us resurrected life. Chose to go into that space of brokenness. Chose to pay that cost of discipleship that we cannot pay on our own, so that we then can live with the benefits of that life. And then we can go on that journey in a different way. And the letter that we hear today from Philemon is a perfect case study. We don't really know that much about him, right? We don't know who he was before he became a Christian, and we don't know what happens after he gets that letter. None of that is in the story. It's just this letter that we hear. But you can bet that at one point he did not sit down with Paul, and Paul looked at him and said, all right, here's the deal. If you become a Christian, here's the next 10 steps that are going to happen, one of which is I'm going to ask you to give up your slaves. And another is, and he didn't have like a contract he signed that got all that worked out, right? Neither did Paul, by the way. He was persecuting the church until he got knocked down off of his horse and blinded and then was on a different journey. So Philemon probably at one point had a choice. He was probably following some of the disciples around saying, tell me more. And just out of that curiosity and that hope, he entered into this journey of faithfulness and following Jesus. And it probably gave him a sense of deeper life than he already had. He then chose to come to these waters and said, I want to be baptized. I want to enter more deeply into this journey. And then as he went along those steps, at some point, when you hear this letter, it sounds like he's a pretty faithful guy that's supportive of others. At some point, Paul ends up in prison. And he says, what do I do now? And now he's got a choice. He can be generous and send his slave to serve Paul instead of staying with him to serve him. And that's what he does. And now Paul sends him back and says, all right, here's your next step. You've been faithful to this point. You've been faithful in your community. You've been faithful in supporting me. But now I'm going to ask you to do something hard. I'm going to ask you to free Onesimus and let him go on his way. And don't just free him, but welcome him as a brother instead of a slave. Wherever Philemon has been on his journey, he now has an opportunity to participate in the liberation of a human being from slavery. And that had to be an amazing thing that happened in his own faith and in the faith of his family. But it also had to be costly. He had this slave, this person that served him, then he had to let that person no longer serve him. He had to free him, which certainly would have come at a cost to his family and to the ways that they were getting by in the world. And yet he probably did it, I'm guessing, the way you hear this letter unfold. Paul makes a pretty compelling argument. But these things happen all around us all the time. I may have shared this story before, but when I was an intern, there was a couple in the congregation. The husband, both, I think, had grown up Lutheran all their lives, so they had been on this journey, right? Invited step by step, deeper and deeper into faithfulness. The husband had an opportunity to go to India. One of the pastors, excuse me, had been to India, and they had a church there they were supporting that had built a building, and he was going for the dedication of the building. And so this guy said, well, somebody should go along with you and just be your travel companion. That was his choice. Do I spend some money, because it's expensive to get to India, do I spend some money now that we could use for other things around the house or whatever, and go with him just to be a travel companion? Or do I not? And he decided to do that. Well, when he got to India, he was welcomed into this community in a way that he had never been before. Partway through the week, the pastor there sat down, the American pastor and this guy, and said, we want you to pray for the whole community. And people just lined up and came in and pointed to stuff and held their kids out. And none of them spoke the same language, but it was this powerful, powerful experience for him of prayer. And God's presence was in this place in a way that he just couldn't understand and couldn't believe he was seeing. So when he went home, he sat down with his wife, and he was so deeply moved that out of their conversation, they decided to sell their house and move into a smaller one so that they could have more money to give to this ministry in India. And he's been every year since, eventually taking his kids with him. And every time he goes, he's giving up things of his own, right? His own resources. They give their Christmas bonuses every year. They've helped build a sewing center. They've helped buy bikes for the ministries they have there. The sewing center was for widows to be able to learn to sew so they can provide for themselves and get out of poverty, which is a liberating sort of thing. And all of this has grown out of one decision to be a travel companion, but then decisions along the way to continue to grow in generosity and to grow in faith as they go through this journey together. Now, many of us aren't in that place where we've had that drastic of a change, and not every step is that big. But Jesus invites us all the time to take steps along our journey. As we gather in this place today, we're all in different places. Some of you have started off a long time ago with a little bit of generosity and found out that it did bring life to you. You've grown and grown and grown in that generosity. Some of you have started to read Scripture maybe a little bit at a time, and now you read it all the time. Others of you are in different places where you're struggling to get those things done, and wherever you are, that's okay. Because what Jesus does is show up where we are and meet us and invite us to take steps. Little steps, big steps, but all steps into that life that Jesus has given us. Now, the great part about that is that there's really no tuition. When I was in school, I had to study and keep my grades at a certain level to keep those scholarships that I had, right? And if you don't go to class, it doesn't go well. If you don't keep paying the bills, you don't get to keep going to school. But that's not how the life that Jesus offers us works. It works instead as if you've got a full ride scholarship for life, and that scholarship is for life, right? It's forever, but it's so that we can have life. And it's always paid, it's always full. We don't have to get good grades, we don't have to be perfect, we don't have to make the right steps all the time to follow Jesus and do what Jesus does. But yet, He already paid that cost. Imagine if you went to school and you didn't have to pay anything, and you didn't have to go to class, and yet you came out the other end knowing everything you needed to know. Does that happen? No, but that's how God's grace works. We don't have to pay for it, we don't have to earn it, and yet we get to live with the benefit of it each and every day. And that benefit frees us to sometimes make those hard choices, to fail at those choices, but yet to continue each day to take those steps into faithfulness, those steps into life. You all chose today to be here. You could have been lots of other places. But just like that crowd that day, you came into this place to gather around this table in this font and to hear this life-giving word. And together we walk out of here step by step deeper into that life that we have been given. Amen.